Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple Podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible.
A quick message before we get started. My name is Dylan, and I'm helping your host, Dr. Chris Kiefer, with a number of exciting projects to expand the podcast. Right now, we're working on a YouTube channel to have video interviews, transcripts for every episode, improvements to the website, and eventually, there will be ways for you to get involved yourself. Decouple will always be ad-free, so if you enjoy the show, please consider donating. You can find a link to our Patreon in the show notes and on the website, decouplepodcast.org. Thank you so much, and enjoy the episode.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest Iida Ruishalme, a biologist, writer, and science communicator. You can find our last episode on science communication and relative risk on the Decouple podcast website. Today we're going to be talking about Iida's trip and writings about Chernobyl. Iida, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's my turn to bungle up your name. It's very easy. Thanks so much, Chris. I'm really happy to come back. It's it was a really great trip, and I'm really happy to talk about my time in Chernobyl.
Yeah, and your podcast is, we only released it last week, and it's flying off the shelves. It's doing very well. So
yay!
The listeners are eager to hear some more from you, and
that's great.
And yeah, I mean, you have a really interesting take on, being a very informed person who went to a very mysterious place where there's a lot of misinformation abounding. It's funny, in thinking about the Chernobyl exclusion zone and sort of journalism that's been done about it, or travel logs, I think I was wasting some time the other night and not the other night, probably about a year ago, and flicking through some Vice. Vice can be it can be entertaining journalism in a way. And they had a thing about hunting the radioactive boars of Chernobyl. And it was this, it was absolutely ridiculous, right? Anyway, it's going to be great to talk to someone who can give us a bit more of a science-based take on it, but also in your writing, it's pretty entertaining stuff, some of the insights that you have. So yeah, maybe again, I think most of our guests will know you from having listened to you a few weeks ago, but can you tell us a little bit, maybe, I'm not sure what generation you are exactly, when Chernobyl first came onto your consciousness? I know I was talking to Geraldine Thomas some time ago, and I was like, was this like a 9/11 moment? Do you remember where you were? I think right. I was too young. I was quite young. I think I was 6 years old at the time. So it didn't come on.
It was a bit similar for me.
Yeah.
I was 5 years old at the time.
Okay.
So actually, I remember growing up with this knowledge. I think I was old enough to absorb that it was something threatening. So I grew up with this solid background knowledge that nuclear is bad because these dangerous fallouts happen. Because a lot of the plume, or so the winds brought clouds to the Nordics. Right. So there was a lot of talk about measuring how much did we receive from Chernobyl, and just this talking about what came here and talking about this invisible threat that arrived. It made it. There was this song that a singer who became a Green Party member, one who was very anti-nuclear, wrote a song which I used to sing aloud, which was like. When I was 8 years old, I was looking in the map for the place where we would go, which would avoid the fallout, and it was obvious that there's this threat.
Right.
So it was sort of this vague big threat. It wasn't a 9/11 moment because it was more like absorbed from the culture.
Right, and mentioning the Nordic countries, I think, isn't that how Chernobyl actually came to the world's consciousness? Was because of a radiation detector at a Swedish power plant. I think someone had been out in the parking lot, got some dust on them, and walked in, and it triggered the ultra sensitive radiation detectors or something.
Yeah, it was a really this old Soviet era, and I think nowadays a Russian era thing where everything happens in secrecy, and you definitely don't admit to any mistakes or anything wrong. And so basically, when something happens, in the case of radiation, we can measure everything, we can detect it. It's really difficult to hide anything. So even really little changes, we can detect them. So yeah, then the outside world from Nordics, came the alarm, I suppose. I didn't remember if it was a sewage power plant, but I do remember that it was, people were asking like, wait, we've measured something here. What's happened over there?
Right.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
Which is this disastrous beginning to a horrible episode, because it shows how much they misabuse the trust of their own populace, and they keep things hidden.
Right.
So this is disastrous, because obviously there were people who died because of this, acting too late, not telling them to avoid exposure to iodine, the radioactive iodine, which you have to do immediately.
Right.
So yeah, that was.
Yeah. So you went from sort of singing songs that kind of reference the plume from Chernobyl to eventually going to visit it. Tell us about like how the trip came about, what motivated you, and I guess what shifted in you that made you maybe want to avoid this place and find the place to hide from the plume, to actually go to the source of it and learn more about this place by visiting it.
Yeah, I mean, because of this, because everybody knows Chernobyl, it was just such an impactful place. So when I realized, it took a long time for me to process some of my own risk perceptions, that I had been so afraid of nuclear waste, that I had been I thought, honestly, that when something goes wrong with nuclear, it results in uninhabitable wastelands. It was just clear picture that obviously that's what happens, and nothing grows, there are no animals, people get sick, you can't go there. So this was my image of Chernobyl for a long time. And then when I started realizing that I had been wrong about so many other things, then it became really fascinating to go there and take another look, first at the data, like what does the data say, and then hearing for the first time, I think the switch went off when I heard about the wolves in Chernobyl. And there was a PBS documentary about the radioactive wolves of Chernobyl. And realizing that they talked about, you have these big populations of wild wolves taking root, or not taking root, they're not plants, but they go in the buildings and they use the old places where people used to live. And just realizing that, wow, so not exactly a wasteland as we think, more like a land for the wolves. And then started reading more about it and hearing about the animals there. So as a biologist, I was really fascinated by okay, so the animals go there and then we can study the effects of radiation. So I remember reading about research on mice near the nuclear reactors, and that they were looking if they can see congenital abnormalities in if there's higher percentage. And I was really surprised that they said that, they can, the mice that live very close to the reactor, they could find a few percent higher birth defects in those mice. And I was thinking like, okay, well, that's something, I suppose. And then when I followed the research later, and I realized that, okay, so it's harder and harder to find these effects. And actually nowadays there's so much less of it. And then more researchers talking about the fact that, hey, this is a place where we actually have to conserve the nature. And just these two images of the uninhabitable wasteland, and then these conservation biologists who are starting to talk about the value of this place. It's just such an image that doesn't go together in your head. So I'm fascinated to these points where we really have a view that sort of turns on its head when you start, the more you know about it. So then during years, I was really fascinated. I was telling my friends who were interested in nuclear and things, topics like these, health research, that I really want to go. And I was just waiting for the opportunity. So finally, when Frankie Fenton from Kennedy Films, who I'd met at COP23 in Bonn, he had been there filming our actions to get nuclear a seat at a table, that we could actually at least discuss the possibility of considering decarbonization with all technologies. He said that, well, actually, he's got some contacts with some researchers and he'd like to go to Chernobyl, and am I interested? Would I like to go? I said, like, wow, would I like to meet Chernobyl researchers? Like, when do we go? Let me check with the babysitter. And so I was stoked, really stoked.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about traveling and the kind of traveling that I would kind of dream of doing, especially in times of COVID when things are so locked down, it's totally being a nerd and going someplace with a bunch of experts in, you know, biology or geology that could, you know, that could explain the landscape to me. And, you know, in history, I'm just such a nerd. I like to understand things on all the different levels possible. So that sounds like, I mean, we probably sound really weird to sort of the general public being like, wow. But I mean, there has been a huge tourism industry that's arisen around Chernobyl. And I don't know, I've heard it described as kind of disaster tourism. I think that might be its own thing, because that the idea there is that you go to like horribly contaminated and polluted places because there's no other tourists there. And sometimes there's like an industrial beauty to these kind of landscapes, whether they're big open pit mines or abandoned shipyards or something like that. But it's almost become a mainstream thing, I think. You know, I'm not sure
It's
what the
become
numbers are,
more
but
and more,
lots
yeah.
of people go there now, right?
Yeah, it's been going on for quite a lot of years. So the tourist streams are going bigger, but it's not. I mean, they don't exactly have an infrastructure to take care of tourists. They have a couple of really old, fallen down buildings in bad shape where, you know, they said that, yeah, unfortunately, we couldn't get the best hotel, the first rate hotel, you know, not that that's the first rate hotel. We got the second best, and the second best was like, yeah, we don't have any warm water.
Yeah.
We have, it looks like, you know, the 70s.
It's an authentic, you know, Soviet era experience, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And um, so there are more tourists, but I would say that it's it's still not a mainstream thing. It's
Yeah.
rather difficult still because you have to have really the bureaucracy and the checkpoints and the guards. You are never allowed to be alone. You always have to have someone with you.
Right.
It is still a sort of cumbersome thing. It's arrangeable, and you can get a tour with a tour guide. Yes.
And there's of course
And it,
there's of course those people who jump the fence, and I forget her name now, but she has a YouTube channel. She's a science nerd who sneaks in and does like experiments, and will do I forget what the techniques are, but she'll take like an apple and maybe like and test it and then eat it if she thinks it's safe, or can show that it's as safe as something growing outside of the zone. And have you heard of her?
yeah, I think I know who you mean. I think it's the one who Veritasium made a documentary about Chernobyl, well, about uh, nuclear, about fission in
Right.
general and radiation. And he visited there, and I think he had her with her. And yes, with an easy googling, I could find her, but I
Yeah,
can't remember her name
I'll
now.
post that in the show notes, people that are interested. But let's talk a bit about your trip then. So we in our last episode we kind of joked about how you tend to have a Geiger counter with you at all times, and you actually, I think that was part of the trip, was looking at what your doses were on various portions of the trip, and also having that sort of global sense of relative risk that you do from comparing radiation to other things like car accidents or air pollution or flying versus driving, that kind of thing, you know, the potted roads of the exclusion zone. So yeah, take us through, maybe we'll just walk through your trip as you kind of go. So, you know, as you fly to Kiev, you're landing in Kiev, and as you kind of progress through. So yeah, take us through that, the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, when I told my husband that I really, really want to go to Chernobyl, and at one point before this, I said that for my birthday I want to arrange a trip to Chernobyl.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it didn't happen then, but he took it seriously, and then he got me a kit. He got me breathing masks, and he got me hazmat suits, and he got me gloves, and he was like, you know, so that you're prepared. And then when I was going, he was like, but you know, be careful.
Uh-huh.
And it's just so natural to be scared when you hear that somebody's going to Chernobyl, because obviously it's a dangerous place, right? This is our image of the place.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I realized that this is such an automatic reaction, and my husband has been, you know, exposed to lots of health science and risk science, so it's not like he's completely ignorant, but it still works on him as well, and on me obviously as well. But I was completely determined to measure, have my Geiger counter on me all times, and have a context like, what is it the exposure like here? What is it like at different places?
Right.
And the natural comparison point was that I flew there. So I had my Geiger counter on the airplane. And on the airplane, it was only a couple hour flight from Switzerland to Ukraine, 2 hour, 40 minutes. And I think we stayed for more than an hour at above 4 millisieverts. Wait. no, millisieverts.
Microsieverts per.
4 microsieverts per hour. 4 microsieverts per hour, and the normal is 0.2 or 0.1 is very normal to have. So this is like 20 times larger than normal. But it's not dangerous. You shouldn't have to be afraid of flying. It's just that the fact is that we're closer to space and we have less protection from the atmosphere, and there's more cosmic background radiation that reaches us. So we get a little bit more of that because it rains down all the time from space.
Right.
So then when I got there, I got a fancier meter to bring with me. So I was really nerding out about the fact that I got this a Chernobyl researcher who like literally wrote the book on Chernobyl, Jim Smith.
Okay.
He lent me his really fancy Geiger meter, which would collect the dosage over the whole time that I was there.
Right.
So then I was ready to measure everything. And obviously we started by going to a town, Narodychi, that's just outside the completely closed off exclusion zone, but it's in the zone of obligatory resettlement. And you're not allowed to live there.
This is like a 30-kilometer square, 30-kilometer radius around the epicenter of the plant?
Exactly. So it's 30 square kilometers around Chernobyl, and it's a little bit skewed to where the winds were pointing at that point. So it's not completely symmetrical. Okay. And on that the part where the winds were pointing, just beside the border, you have Narodychi.
Okay.
And it sits in the area which they said, okay, we're moving everybody out from here. Yeah. You're not staying here. But various political and individual decisions and political situation and bureaucratic moves, they weren't forced out by gunpoint, and they just stayed. They decided as a community to stick to.
Okay.
So
that's like children. That's the whole community, right? They didn't partially evacuate.
The whole community. There's kindergarten teachers and children, and there's a community like a house, a town hall. There's a lot of people there. A lot of the people who wanted better opportunities, obviously, probably moved out, but you have a lot of old people there, and you still have people with young kids. So not everybody moved out, even of the younger generation. There's 10,000 people there.
Wow.
But you're not allowed to build new houses. You're not even allowed to really renovate your houses, or you're not allowed to start new business, or you're not allowed to. Okay. So it's sort of like it's frozen in place. You're technically you can still stay there. Nobody's forcing you out, but you're not allowed. Your hands are tied.
You can't reverse. Yeah. There's a book called The World Without Us, and it's about like if all the humans disappeared, what would happen to our built environment, and how quickly the roofs would leak and the frost would break apart the concrete. And I guess that's kind of what you see in places like
exactly. And that was like there was this huge town hall, this impressive building of the town, and it's cracked everywhere and old and dirty, and it's like
because they're not allowed to fix it.
Yeah, you can't.
Yeah. Let's step back to your arrival in Kiev, because I understand that you got a bit sick as soon as you got to Kiev.
Right. That's when we got to Kiev. We had quite an ordeal to find a driver in traffic who didn't speak any English, only Ukrainian. And then when we wandered to the center, in the absolute center, we had our hotel. And I was sleeping on, I think, on the 5th or 6th floor or something like this. And I woke up, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't sleep because I was coughing. It wasn't like nonstop, but it was every minute or every half a minute because it would just keep tickling in my throat. It got really annoying, and I ended up trying to sort of like, I read through the hotel manuscript and the description, and there was 24/7 room service and breakfast at 7, and this is not a service-minded culture. In Eastern Europe, you're not service-minded. You're practical, and you're not serving anyone. Yeah. So it wasn't like no tea anywhere. Like 7:30.
Right.
And then I was at the restaurant coughing from 7:10, and finally 7:20 they said like, okay, you can have tea. And I was like, why do I have this? And then I started thinking about the fact that Right. When I woke up, the whole horizon was filled in this quite atmospheric fog over the whole city. The sunrise was this incredible city fog landscape.
Right.
And then I was like, could that actually be smog? And then I started Googling about air quality in Kiev.
Yeah.
And Ukraine is not one of the better places in Europe. And Kiev is a really big town. And the funny thing around Kiev is that all the agricultural lands, several times during the time when we moved around there, we saw burning fields. It was in the autumn, and they say that the researcher I talked to, they said that, yeah, it's unfortunately very common to burn the stubble of the field, the land rest, so that you get rid of it nicely, and then the ashes give you some fertilizer.
That's a big contribution to like bad air pollution in Delhi, which I think has one of the worst air quality in the world. I think in the Punjab they do that same cropping strategy, and a lot of that, and plus the cars, I guess with like they don't have proper catalytic converters on their cars, and probably
there were lots of ladas. I don't know if you're used to them, but we have. It's like lots of ladas in the traffic.
Yeah.
So realizing how bad the air pollution is, I was getting really paranoid with my cough about there.
Right.
And then when we were about to leave to Chernobyl, a little bit like my husband, who was worried about me, our cameraman came to me and said, like, so how big a risk do we get when we go to Chernobyl? How dangerous is it? Like, what should we be careful of, and what do we need to keep in mind? And he came to me after he had just smoked a cigarette out on the street by the 3-lane traffic in the 5-road crossing in the smog landscape. And I was like, I really don't want to be like, if you care about your health, then what's a cigarette?
Yeah.
No, obviously that's something you choose to do and you enjoy to do, and even though it's very risky, often we don't realize how risky it is, and we do it anyway.
So walk us through those relative risks. And I do want to, I haven't really had a show yet on particulate air pollution, and we can't do a whole show on that right now, but I don't know if you could just do a quick aside here and tell us about those relative risks of smoking, and describe to us what is 2.5 micron particulate air pollution and its health impacts.
Right. So you talk about PM 2.5 or PM 10, or these are the terms you use when you talk about air pollution, which means basically how many micrometers you have on the particulate matter. How big are the little particles? So if you measure the air, what size do you generally get? And with particulates, to a certain point, the smaller, the more dangerous, because if they're very, very small, they get into our little cavities in our lungs, in the alveoli. You probably know these terms better. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they penetrate deeper in, where they can, do more harm. So that's a little bit like smoking. Smoking has particulates as well. So there we inhale it directly, and in air pollution we have a more diluted version all the time. And this increases the risk not only for cancer, but also for lung cancer, obviously, but also for different kind of circulatory diseases, because our bloodstream suffers from these effects as well.
So these particles are so small, they get in the bloodstream and they get deposited into brain tissue, into heart tissue, into the vascular walls. And it's a big, like, we always think about like eating too much bacon as the cause for heart attacks and strokes, and there's a dietary component for sure, but I think the World Health Organization is really kind of, as the evidence is pouring in, revising a lot of that to emphasize what an enormous risk factor air pollution is for these things we don't usually associate it with. I think people think air pollution, they're like, okay, lung stuff, right? Like asthma, emphysema, but no, a heart attack, strokes, and cancer as well. Yeah.
Yes. So it's basically all those things which kill most people, especially in the rich parts of the world. Those air pollution is a big one there. And so it's a really big killer. It kills, I think the estimates vary, but basically I think it's between somewhere like 3 million to 7 million people in the world every year because of ambient air pollution. So outdoor air that you breathe in. Then there's a whole different matter of indoor air when you have fires indoor. That's really harmful as well. But just outdoor air, something you can't escape. You have to go outside. It's good for you to go outside, but then you have to breathe in these particulates, and millions of people die.
Yeah.
Way prematurely, live much sicker lives because of the air pollution, which we all have to breathe. So we can't not breathe.
We've talked about sort of flying and the higher doses of radiation, which don't have any health implications per se. I mean, flying in and of itself is much safer than driving.
Yes.
And then you arrive in Kiev and you're being asked about the risks of the health risks from actually visiting the exclusion zone, and you're actually in a much quote unquote like riskier environment in terms of, and you're actually having health effects, right? In terms of
so basically, when you're looking at the health effects, obviously the long term are most important. So if you live in a place where it's all the time, it's heightened, then you get quite quickly just a little bit worse. Gives you something like 6% increase in premature mortality. And in Kiev, I think we're more like 15 or 30%. It's a notable increase. But then there's also studies about the just short term exposure. If you look at how much do deaths go up on those days when you suddenly have a bit higher. So just look at the like daily mortality rates, and on around the levels that I was exposed to there, you could already be up 0.5 or 1% in daily mortalities because of that level of air pollution.
And that corresponds to things like the London fog, which I think 4,000 or 5,000 people died when all of this coal smoke basically just hung in the air over London for a number of days, right?
Yeah, there's a different. I think it's even up to 12,000. It's difficult always to estimate exactly because it was, but thousands and thousands of people can die quickly when you get high enough, and sorry. No air pollution here. just normal cough. No COVID, no air pollution. So basically our risk was already around the 0.5, 1% higher because we were in Kiev.
Go ahead.
And then you look at what kind of exposures can people get from Chernobyl. And it's just, let's even take like the worst case scenario. Let's not take now as a visitor. Let's take back then as a liquidator. When you were like, our host was Gennady Laptev, who was a liquidator. He was this old, big Ukrainian physicist guy who was now working at the Hydrometeorological Institute and studied Chernobyl ever since. And he was drawn in and he was flying the helicopter over the power plant, measuring the radiation levels in this vicinity, and they were like hit with the plume every now and then. Wow. And they would, as Gennady said it, which I think was really fascinating. He said they were physicists. They were in the helicopter. They knew radiation science really well. They were measuring they had these huge devices back then that beeped, and they had breathing devices and everything, masks to protect them. And every time they would, when there was beeping, obviously, beep, 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 beep. And then the plume would hit because the wind shifts and the plume hits the helicopter. And then the measurer will go beep, it will flatline because there's too much. Right. And he said that every time it happened, instinctively, he would go,
hold his breath
until the breath. Yeah. It doesn't matter. There's no effect at all of holding your breath. But you're scared, there's something dangerous out there. Your measurement device is saying it, so you hold your breath. It's one of these little things you do to try to alleviate these fears. It just happens automatically. So he used to think that, okay, well, because I've been hit by so much radiation, I can smoke and I can do I don't have to worry so much because my risk is already, I'm going to get cancer. I'm going to get cancer. And then his friend Jim Smith, who had been working with him for years and years. So Jim Smith and Gennady Laptev were like our main guys who took us around. And Jim said that, well, after years of listening to this, he was like, he's not so sure if Gennady should be so blasé about smoking and all like this. And he actually went and published a study looking at the population of liquidators. What kind of risk do they have of cancer, lifetime incidence, has it been increased a lot. And those liquidators who worked in this area back then have about 1.4% increase. Your usual cancer rate is like 40%. It's 40% chance that we will have cancer, we'll develop cancer during our lives. So theirs is like 41%.
And if you if you smoke, what if your background's 40? Smoking takes you.
Smoking is like you're likely to die,
right,
of cancer.
50% of smokers die because of smoking.
Yeah, exactly. So that's like a complete. It's not that you're, I would have to check because it's just so much bigger that there's no point of comparing these little increases in risk.
Right.
You usually don't talk about in the same context. You may compare it, but in these, it's a tiny increase. So smoking would be like, another, I don't know, another 40% or another increased on top of that. So basically, Jim was like, look, Gennady, you should think about quitting smoking. It's not that likely that you'll get cancer, no more likely than the rest of us, really.
Yeah.
And he did.
Oh, wow.
I didn't see him smoke one cigarette. He was like, oh, all right. So maybe he can, So 1.4 for liquidators, 0.5% increase just for a day in Kiev. For that day, for the whole population in Kiev, we have the same kind of increase because of the normal air pollution around. And it's really like there's been so much focus on these Chernobyl liquidators and their risks and people, and then our worry about what is our risk going to visit the place 30 years after the fact with full knowledge and measurements and checkpoints and everything. And we're worried about going there. When, maybe if we worked in the emergency effort, we should have been considered, where we go. And still our risk wouldn't be bigger than just living in Kiev.
So on our last show, we talked a little bit about the theatrics of visiting the Switzerland's interim nuclear waste storage site, and all the booties you put on and where you can put your feet and where you can't, and to minimize doses to below that of the natural background. What is it like in terms of visiting Chernobyl, in terms of those theatrics or those measures? Are they justified? Is it over the top? And what impact did it have on you visiting and on those with you who maybe weren't as well informed?
I think it has a huge impact because there's these really strict rules about what you're allowed to do or not when you go to Chernobyl. You're basically allowed to, you're told to have, you can't have t-shirts or shorts. Obviously, these are the written rules, and then what people do who work in the zone, they don't really mind. The t-shirts are quite normal, but in the rules it says so. And then something that they were very particular about was that, especially our driver, right? Our driver is a normal guy, Ukrainian guy, who has these rules that he's allowed to be a driver in the Chernobyl zone. And he was really miffed at me for, in his non-English way, when we stopped after Narodychi, we visited this town, which was just outside, and we went back along this zone, and we actually stopped somewhere where there's this guerrilla farmer. There's like this Ukrainian freedom fighter type who has moved to the area there where you're not allowed to develop anything or cultivate the land, and he decided, like, yeah, here's a nice piece of land, I'll start cultivating it. And he's like, not exactly legal, but he has huge fields. Nobody's using the land, and lots of people, like the Narodychi town people, they live there and they need food, and basically it's been going on for a while now, and nobody stopped it. Nobody stopped him.
Right.
And he's so they were talking a little bit with him, and during this time I was playing with a dog, a little puppy, on the and I got really dirty. I got sand on me and stuff because we're running in the sand, rolling in the sand. And then when I came back, I realized that our van driver had been like standing, looking at me, playing with the dog, and he was there with my big water bottle. You have to bring lots of water, and it was really hot and he was like, it's like, now we wash because this is Chernobyl dirt.
Right.
You're not. So we weren't in the proper area yet. We weren't inside the checkpoints, but it's really careful.
And these restrictions, like if you're on one side of the, I guess the outs, like what is it like? Is the whole area fenced, or just there's checkpoints on any kind of road access that you'd have in? And like on one
The
side of
road
that,
access.
on one side of that swinging gate, you could play with the dog and get dirty. On the other side, you can't. Is that sort of what the rules would be like? Or
I think that for a lot of the area, there's checkpoints where you have to pass radiation controls.
Okay.
A lot of the time, we went through so many beeping machines, checking out, scanning us whether we picked up any radioactive dirt. None of us had at any time. And you're allowed to touch the ground, and you're allowed to do whatever, dig and stuff like this in most of the area, because it's just really normal area. There's only certain hotspots. So then they do have these special rules around the obviously around the power plant, and then in the red forest.
Right.
So just a kilometer or two from the main reactor that had a meltdown, you have a few square kilometers of forest, which was hit the hardest, which is like the hotspot interest for what happens when you get really high dose, and where the trees died. And you are allowed to visit that, but you needed a special permit to go there, which unfortunately my filming crew didn't prioritize. So I had to just see that it's over there. It looks like forest. And I asked our zoologist, and he's like, you won't tell it apart, it's just forest. But there you're not allowed to put anything on the ground.
Right.
You have to have a special I think you might have to have special booties as well. And then you're not allowed to put like anything, not your papers, your cameras, your any equipment that you carry. It has to be carried on you all the time. You're not allowed to touch the ground. If you have a tripod, you have to have that special plastic sheet that you put the tripod on, not on the ground. So it's so it is really, especially since I asked the researchers who've been working in the zone for decades, have been coming there several times a year, doing field experiments, going into the red forest, taking samples from the cooling pod dams, looking at the fish. They said that during all this time of them and their research teams and their students coming and going, once had it happened that somebody had managed to find that clump of dirt that had a hot particle in it, a strongly radiating particle in it, so that when they went to a checkpoint, it went off. It said, we can detect a higher level here in your shoe. And then they went back, and they went behind the checkpoint building, and they brushed the shoe a bit, some mud off the shoe, and they went back again, and then they were let through. So
yeah, it kind of reminds me, I mean, it makes me think about like a biohaz level 4 lab where they'd work with coronaviruses or Ebola or something, and this idea that you could bring this clump of dirt out with you, and then it could get out into the world and infect everybody. Like that sort of seems to be the psychology
exactly.
It's playing
There's
into.
an infectiousness thought about it, that it's so dangerous that it has to be contained. But as we talked about in the beginning, that you can't hide radiation. You can always detect it. It's really easy. So yes, I think that a lot of the precautions are really not necessary. I mean, just looking at the studies that have been done with the evacuations, and that 80-90% of the evacuations from Chernobyl weren't justified. People are worse off because they were moved.
Well, and you mentioned
it's not about acute dangers moving out in the world because we're there. No.
And that fatalism that you talked about of the liquidator who was saying, well, I was exposed, so I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well smoke and drink. That's not unique. That's very, very common, and has a really huge health impact, because people do these things that, as we talked about in the last show, have a very strong, measurable increase in your cancer risk, say from being a regular drinker or smoking. But I want to get back to the red forest, because as a biologist, I think this is interesting. What I've heard is that I think it's because of the chromosomal complexity of pine trees that they were particularly affected by the radiation. Do you know anything about that?
Well, actually, I have to say that I don't. I had a really good botany lecture at school, but I didn't continue on the botany side.
Okay.
I mean, there was a big pine forest. In the area, so I just
remember hearing that pine trees, again, because of the way that their chromosomes are arranged, or the number of chromosomes they have, were more vulnerable to the radiation, and that's why it was this pine forest in particular. I mean, it was also in the plume, but I think I'm not sure. I think some of the deciduous trees were okay, but and certainly like
that's interesting.
Yeah, Anyway, maybe we'll throw it in the show notes.
Yeah, and the fact that there was a little area where the trees died, but then in a few more square kilometers, you had an area where it just inhibited their growth for a few years. So they had like a hiatus of recovery, and then after a few years they continued.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, well, let's talk a little bit about this, since we're kind of into the forests and things, into the nature trips, the safari side of things. I think you got to see the unpronounceable wild horse, the Przewalski horse. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about some of the nature viewing and your sense of the landscape. Because again, you talked earlier about that language of, and I think Ralph Nader's talked about this when talking about, if there was a nuclear accident in Ohio, the living would envy the dead,
right.
This wasteland, kind of
wasteland thinking. Yeah. It's actually interesting. The first place we visited, Dennis, one of the Chernobyl biosphere guy who works there, said that he had just seen a wolf at the cooling pond the day before, and he said, go very early and you might have a chance, because there's lots of animals that come to the cooling ponds to eat mussels, and they dig up. So these are the cooling ponds that cool the reactor, which is melted down. The horrible. I thought that if anywhere in this cooling pond we would see how life is devoid, there's nothing. Right. And then no, there's lots of mussels, and they come to eat them. There's raccoon dogs and foxes, and there's deer, and there's herons, and they all come there. So the foxes come there too, and to hunt on them, and otters and badgers and whatnots. Wow. So maybe you can spot one there. And we went there, and obviously we didn't get around with cameras and people, and it didn't happen very early in the morning. You also have to have your guide with you, and the guide wasn't waking up very early.
Eastern European customer service.
When we got there, yeah, customer service, exactly. But we saw a lot of bird life and stuff. But the story we heard, there was big very empty warehouse next to the cooling pond. Just you have the reactors behind you, like these big buildings, kilometer or so in the vicinity from the power plants. The cooling ponds are there, and they said that warehouse used to house minks. Mink is the word in English, right?
Okay,
yeah. These like furry weasel, animals that you use for clothing.
Yeah.
So they used to house minks, and they grew minks there. And then the accident happened, and all the minks were,
right.
They died, or I don't know if they actually killed them and took away. Anyway, no more minks. But what were left behind when the people left quickly were lots of dogs. People had dogs, and lots of dogs were left behind. And guard dogs of the facility itself and stuff like this. And then people thought, like, well, they'll die. It's the middle of the accident area, and lots of radiation, and nobody to take care of them. And then they came there a year later, and they were astonished, because there was this really, really thriving community of dogs that stayed at that warehouse. In many places that you still had dogs, but that warehouse was like this big flock was living there.
Right.
And they went like, where did they get their food? And it turned out that they had dug into the mink warehouse, where they had the mink food still left. And apparently they had a lead dog who was really good at, he wouldn't let the dogs eat everything at once. It was regulated.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
This is what they said. Interesting behavior. Anyway, that they had enough food, so that they had managed. And the most astonishing thing was that they said that these dogs had the best fur ever. It was really luscious, glistening, wonderful, soft fur, right, because of the mink food optimized for fur growth.
Yeah, wow.
So this is the horrible dogs left behind in this wasteland, live well on mink food, and
yeah. And you had a really interesting anecdote specifically about the dogs, and the fact that you were kind of unsure if they would be friendly or not. And I think that probably plays into the kind of tropes of, like, radiation induced monsters, and maybe these dogs would be really mean. But that A, that the dogs are really nice, and B, that they really don't, like, they're only sort of where people are, like, they're, because I think the wolves eat them if they go actually farther away from where people live.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you have Chernobyl town where you have lots of the where you have tourists can actually sleep over, and we have official government buildings and people who work in the zone live there. And then you have the power plant itself, where you have to drive a bit away to get to a power plant. So both these areas where you have people, the power plant area and the Chernobyl town especially, have lots of dogs. They're everywhere. Every building with bureaucrats inside or workers inside, you will have these chill dogs lying around, their heads against the entrances. And yeah, when I came, it was getting dark and they were starting to bark. And I was like, okay, so there are wild dogs on the streets in the dark in Chernobyl. I feel slightly a little bit more insecure. And then in the morning when I saw them and when I was working, like, okay, nobody's reacting to them. There's lots of dogs here. Like, I think there's 15 dogs here. I'll just walk normally. I like dogs, but I don't know these. And they were all wagging their tails and like, yeah, hello, person, person. They were really, really just like normal tame dogs. Because and one of the sad things about the people's fate, I think, was when people told me that, yeah, a lot of people come to work long times in the zone. They stay weeks or months in the zone, but they're not obviously allowed to have their homes there because nobody's allowed to live there. But they spend long times there and they get lonely and they really appreciate the dogs. So during that time, they feed the dogs and they have, people do take care of them.
Yeah, that's so funny. Okay,
and
well,
exactly. No dogs outside of the zone because that's the wolf's territory.
And the
wolves don't come close to the people, but
I grew
if
up
the dog gets out.
I grew up on the countryside, and yeah, I mean, the coyotes would constantly be eating our cats, and they lured one of our neighbor's dogs away, big Rottweiler, big strong dog, and they lured it out and played and looked vulnerable, and then the whole pack just pulled this Rottweiler apart. So it's interesting, that story of kind of domestication and this ongoing relationship between people and dogs and wolves in Chernobyl. Okay, well, let's get to the really exciting stuff. Actually being at the plant, going inside. I understand. I didn't really even know that you could go inside, or you were inside the control room. I understand there was 3 other reactors that actually kept operating after the disaster at Unit 4, I think, until like the year 2000.
Right.
Demystify a little bit the actual sort of ground zero of this place for us.
Yeah, there's I hadn't learned about it until quite recently as well, that the place continued operating. They weren't people working there or living at the power plant, but they would come every day with the train and continue working there. Like, okay, we have this meltdown here, and then we have normal operations at units 1, 2, and 3. Wow. So I think that
that was for another like 15 years after the accident, I think, right?
Yeah, exactly. The last reactor was shut down around 2000, I think, and they're still in official work of decommissioning, and so it's a place where lots of people are there. You have a lot of people working there all the time, so it's like it's an everyday place for these people. They go to work just like normally at Chernobyl. It's not so strange for them. It's like there's a canteen. We went to the Chernobyl canteen at the power plant.
Yeah,
it's nearer to the to reactors 1 and 2, nearer to the cooling pond, and so there's radiation detectors, and then you go and eat.
Yeah.
And there was some really, really nice kefir, this sour milk. It was nice food. You're just, and having worked at normal companies where you have canteens, it's bizarre that it's normal, and for the outside world it's something so mystical and so terrifying. No, I would say that it's pretty Soviet. It's pretty like big gray buildings and many of them not in great shape, and it's very bureaucratic, and there's a big military presence because you have guards and you have checkpoints. But other than that, it's quite like having a visit in another power plant, really. This rigid structure of you have to meet the person, and you have to have permits, and you have to have your IDs, and then you have to go in and you have to get all your hairnets and your booties and your lab coats, and then they gave you additionally a breathing mask. And we all wore a breathing mask very nicely, and I don't think those play much any role, really. Again, I think it's
what was your Geiger counter doing at this point? Like around the plant or inside? You can actually go inside the plant, I heard?
Inside the turbine halls.
Okay.
Which are like 50 meters. The reactor is like 50 meters from that spot. through the wall is like, there is the reactor that melted down.
Wow.
So you can get really close in that way. I mean, obviously it's shielded by the wall, so it's no problem in that way.
And what kind of doses did you get, like 50 meters away from this melted core area compared to the airplane?
I got around 20 microsieverts per hour.
Okay. And in the airplane, you were getting, what was it?
4.
6? 4. Okay.
4. 4 point, almost 5, 4.5, something like this. But mostly around Chernobyl, when we walked in the forests, my dog wants to have something to say. I don't know if you hear it. It's 0.1, 0.2. When we were in Chernobyl town with our hotel.
That's similar to Switzerland? 0.
Yeah, that's similar to Switzerland, that's similar to Sweden, that's similar to Finland, apart from some areas where you have higher backgrounds. But basically, your really boring places will have 0.1, 0.2, and that was mostly, most of the time I had that, in Chernobyl town, for instance. Then when you're around the power plant, then you have more like, I had 0.9 or 1, and at the cooling pond, I got between 2 or 3. So there is like, you had these waters that come from the reactor, from cooling the waters at the reactor, and then they come to this pond, and then this pond has been dried out so that you're in the sort of the lake bed, which has grown up with bushes. And we were searching for mice. I got to follow the researchers search for the traps if they find mice, and they found mice every morning. We took around, and almost every trap had another. And there you have around 2 to 3 microsieverts per hour. So it's not as bad as at an airplane.
Right.
The cooling pond of the Chernobyl reactor is not. So it's only when you get really close to the reactor when you actually get any higher readings. So this 20 microsieverts per hour. And that's still not dangerous. That's still nothing that I should maybe I think I could camp there for quite long times before I could get anywhere where we could actually start speaking of. And again, you'd have to have populations of hundreds of thousands or millions actually camping there
to detect,
to start thinking like, yeah, maybe we could detect if we wait until you all die.
Right.
Some of you might
die like a year early. Yeah. If you camp there. So you were actually in the control room. I saw a picture of you like touching the switch that they touched that had set the whole thing off. Yeah. Tell me about that.
Yeah.
That's a crazy piece of history, and just being able to touching the button. My God.
Yeah, it is really cool. They were doing these really reckless experiments with the reactor where you're trying to increase the efficiency. You have lots of physicists who go through this very, very detailed. I just know the general gist that they were experimenting this. And then when it started going wobbly, and they were like, wait a minute, doesn't look good. Okay, let's just shut everything down. And at that point, the quick shutdown was the wrong thing to do, which sort of set it off. You shouldn't have shut it down in that way. And this is one little old black switch, like your 60s type switchboard things. And they said they showed us that this is the switch, which was flicked. And then suddenly you had, you heard a big boom. And like, why, what happened? And they sent one person in to visually confirm what happened, open the door to the reactor room and see. And this person would go in, and then it was like, I can see stars.
Oh my God.
There's a hole. Like, close the door. And with us at the power plant was actually Boris, who was not the official guide, but he was helping us. And he told us that, he was off duty, but he was working back at the day. And then he was free, and he had gone in the channel where the cooling pond water comes to their plant. And in the channel there was lots of good fish. So he was fishing.
So and he was fishing, and he was like,
on the night of the accident. And then it was like, vroom, he saw the roof fly off.
Right.
And there he was, old and in good health, from all I can tell.
Yeah.
Happy to give me a tour of the power plant.
Right.
And yeah, so then it was like having these people there and having the history in the room with me, and they were like, so this is the switch that was flicked, and then it all happened. So it was really incredible. Wow, this piece of history really happened. I'm really here. Wait, it happened. Incredible. Yeah.
So how do you like, because you talk about Chernobyl in these articles, and I think it's really important that, you know, it's tricky because it's when we talk about an industrial accident across a variety of other sources, whether that's, you know, different energy sources or chemical plants or even you know, an airplane crashing, the language that's used is more along the lines of accidents. When we talk about Fukushima or Chernobyl, it's a catastrophe or a disaster. And I don't know if there's like actual words to use, but I think it's important we don't minimize. There were people who died and whose health was severely impacted. You know, 28 of the plant operators and mostly firefighters succumbed to acute radiation sickness of, I think, around 130. And of those 130, a lot of them had bad thermal burns. And, you know, this was an accident that caused a lot of harm. But how do you, because I think what you do is you bring a lot of sanity to the discussion in terms of, okay, well, there's risks, there's hazards here, let's interpret them in relation to others. But how do you communicate that without, you know, I guess, minimizing too much, maybe
right.
Like,
I think that this is a great point that you bring up, because while we were at the power plant, we were obviously, it was a fascinating piece of history, but it was not only that. I also cried when I was at the plant. We were shown to a place where there was one of the workers, one of the liquidators who had been working at the plant at the time being not the liquidators, the plant workers had been crushed under the structures inside. They couldn't retrieve his body. He was left there. And there was a memorial for him at the wall that was closest to where you could get to, but he was in there somewhere. And just the tragedy of the lives that were lost and how many people were affected. There were lives that the people who died directly, and then obviously it's also at the same time important to realize the wrenching effects on the people who were evacuated from the place, and important to set in relation with what was the role of the government in this. What kind of responsibility did they have? How did they handle it? And obviously they handled it very badly. But then there's a different point to this, which is like if I'm for nuclear and I'm at Chernobyl where people died and people's lives were destroyed, how can I stand there and be like, Leah, I'm here to say that, you know, nuclear is really good?
Right.
No, it's not. It was also the fact that I wanted to come there because I realized that it was a really bad thing. It was a horrible thing that happened to these people. And the fact is that I may not ever be able to fully comprehend what it was like to be there and live there and have this happen to you. But I want to respect that. I want to acknowledge that these people went through something horrible. And also the fact that I want to respect all human life. So I'm not doing this because I'm glib about people who lived in Chernobyl, people who died, workers who died there. I'm doing this because I am compassionate about lives lost. I'm compassionate about the fact that while I may not empathically feel the lives of the people who die in Kiev out of air pollution, their lives are destroyed as well. There are family members, there's grandparents, there's parents who die, are taken away too early all the time because of the choices that we make. And there are these ones which grab our attention. So people who die in a very spectacular, very dangerous sounding ways grab our attention so that we remember them more clearly. And we need to respect that they gave their lives, but at the same time we can't ignore the rest of the people who die. We have to remember that human life is precious. We all only have one life, and we can't ignore that millions die because we didn't make great decisions about energy, and that we actually still have this possibility of making better decisions and seeing to it that so many more people don't have to have that same fate. So it's more that I want to respect people who died at this accident, and I don't want to make it disappear and sound like it was nothing. It was a huge thing, and radiation played a part, especially for those 28 people plus the people who died of thyroid later, thyroid cancer later. So up to 200 people possibly were destroyed. Their lives were taken or are being taken because of radiation. I don't want to make that go away. I want to be very aware of that, know what we have to avoid. But at the same time, we have to pay that respect forward. We have to take other people into account as well. So this is exactly, how do we make sure that in the future, less families are affected like this? How do we make sure that the most amount of people that we can live full lives and healthy lives without anybody destroying it for them?
I think one of the ways I think about Chernobyl in the broader arena of nuclear energy is thinking of it a little bit like the Hindenburg of aviation, in terms of the plant design, the safety culture, the government responses. I mean, we learn a lot from nuclear accidents, right? And 3 Mile Island, I think, really changed a lot around the safety culture and operating culture and simplifying controls and things like that. And Fukushima Daiichi, again, unfortunately, it takes accidents to learn and get better, but things drastically improve, as they did from the age of the Hindenburg, where we realized that using hydrogen probably wasn't the greatest way to float a blimp or to aviate. And so, yeah, and there's this tendency to want to then say, well, because of the Hindenburg, we're not going to use nuclear at all, and that leaves us with, well, things like coal or things like gas that heat the climate or poison the air. And in terms of Ukraine, I guess I was speaking with a friend a little while ago. I understand 50% of their electricity still comes from nuclear. This is a country that was scarred by this accident. What was your take in speaking with Ukrainians about their attitudes towards nuclear energy going forward?
I was really, really nervous when I struck up my first discussion with a Ukrainian woman, Tatiana, at the Narodychi town. They had a kindergarten in the town where they housed the town's 120 kindergarten-aged children. And she was the leader of this place. There were lots of teachers there, obviously. And she showed me around. I mean, there was some really warm Ukrainian hospitality. She was incredibly warm and welcoming, and really enthusiastic about showing their how they painted everything, colorful things, colorful patterns and flowers, and it was a really lots of care and love went into that place. And at the same time, Narodychi's fate is very, very, it's very frozen in time, and it's sort of paralyzed by the bureaucracy, and because they are suffering at the aftermath of the accident, whether it be human or psychology or government or where you want to put the blame, they don't have any dangerous levels of radiation, but the idea can still be very threatening. So I wasn't expecting that they would have positive views of nuclear power, and it was rather that she didn't really think about it so much. When I told her that, I'm here because I think that we need to think about the environment, and that nuclear is actually an important tool in trying to make our energy mix less burdensome on the environment, that we can actually mitigate climate change and do it well with nuclear, and that we can do it in a way that doesn't have effects like it's had in Chernobyl, that we know better now. And she kept smiling, and she said that, yeah, she has a positive outlook on the future. She said that she's like the children. She sees the future in bright colors. And I was like, wow, here's a woman whose life has been shadowed by this incident. And I tell her, like, I think actually that we should use more nuclear. And I was thinking that she might be really cross with me, or that she might not, be very welcoming after that. But it didn't change her at all. She said, yeah, she thinks environment is very important, and they want to teach the children a very good connection with nature. So really, during our whole trip there and talking to people, nobody was really neither negative or positive. They were quite neutral about it.
Right. Interesting.
Maybe it's I don't know. We are activists, and we are very interested, and we come in contact with lots of people who have strong opinions, right?
Yeah.
But then when I've been to other places too, and events, and just talk to people on the street, and there in Chernobyl, there's not always so strong opinions as we'd expect from our encounters that we have online by people who are interested, who seek those confrontations.
Right. Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Any other takeaways? Anything we didn't discuss that you're burning to share with the audience about this trip, or any takeaways?
Well, I when we were getting back from Chernobyl, and we were discussing a little bit about how people relate to this, we actually went to a town that's south of close to the area, but in a different direction, which is normal functioning town. And there's a doctor there who is exploiting, in our view, the researchers there, and our view, he's exploiting the fears of the townspeople. He's making them think that they are in a really increased risk. So these are people who live well outside of the zone and not in the direction of the wind, and they don't really have any higher exposures from radiation. They have more air pollution, really, because they are, closer to the city, the big city. And the doctor there keeps like this regimen of monitoring people's health, monitoring kids' health, and has like programs of exchange of sending children away for holidays so that they may recuperate from the dangers of living so close to Chernobyl.
Wow.
And it was really shocking to me to hear everything that's happening there, and that in some places people go on as usual, but in other places where you have an authority figure that sort of brings up these topics and makes these people sort of the subjects of his monitoring experiments, they can really get a lot more fear from they are afraid of course, like what is happening with our children, or will there be an effect, and so on. And we were talking about this relation, how do you approach risk? And Jim said that, he must say that he thinks it's difficult, because even if he would say he would have mushrooms, and he would know that those mushrooms have a 1 millisievert dose. So in Chernobyl you have cesium 137, I think it's called, radioactive cesium around the area, which is most of the so the leakage is left as cesium. And as Jerry Thomas might have told you as well when she was here, that has a very long half-life, and even though you get it in your system, it doesn't really affect you much, because it leaves again. It doesn't have a radioactive when the atom falls apart.
And it doesn't accumulate in any tissue the way that
it doesn't accumulate. It's not very active. So if you would have a mushroom plate with this higher dose of cesium, and it would have 1 millisievert dose, and 1 millisievert is, we talked about microsieverts per hour during this time. And during my whole trip, I accumulated in Chernobyl, so I was there 2 nights, and during 3 days, I accumulated around 9 microsieverts, if I remember correctly. And during my plane ride, I got 16 microsieverts. During my 2 plane rides together, to get there, I got, almost double what I got the whole time during there. So, but in a year, we will all get several millisieverts. We will get a couple of millisieverts, usually. In the US, I think it's about 6.4. So then if you'd have 1 extra millisievert, it doesn't accumulate, and it's not really that dangerous. You should, the atom bomb survivors who got above 100 millisieverts in 1 big blast, there you start seeing this slight increase in risk. So 1 millisievert is really not that much. So Jim said that, I would eat it. It wouldn't be a problem for me. I know it's not dangerous. So I'd eat it. But he said, the real test is, would I feed it to my child?
Wow. Yeah.
And then he was like, so And in a way, he was saying that it's a problem because this is something that we can't overcome because, there's still this uncertainty. And actually, it was late in the night and we were going to bed and so on, but I realized afterwards that actually what he was just talking about is that we all have the automatic fear, and there are some triggers that just bring it up, as we talked about the unfamiliar or familiar things, that when things is unfamiliar and artificial, and when it's outside of our control, it's more dangerous. So this is something that's artificial because it's a leaked radiation. But it's sort of familiar for Jim because he's a researcher, he knows it, and it's under his control whether he wants to eat this mushroom or not. So it's not necessarily so scary. But then he brings the one factor in which immediately puts on the alarm bells, which is children.
Yeah.
Any potential for harm to children, and we're already as parents, we're already really concerned. It doesn't matter how much we reflect. In the immediate moment, we're always scared and we always want to shield our children. So in a way, I think he said that it was sort of a test of the fact that humans can't get up over the fear of radiation, or that he can't be sure that there wouldn't be an effect. Whereas I thought that, it's rather that we should all be understanding of that these reactions are around, that we all have them, but that while you don't have to feed your kid mushrooms if you have any doubts about them whatsoever, because it's not important whether you feed them these mushrooms or not. When we make more long-term decisions about affecting our health and the health of our environment, we can get over these. We don't have to have this momentary instinctual response. We can think.
I think the main issue that I've learned from you is just that we cannot think about risks in isolation. Like, it exists in a whole ecosystem of other risks. Right. And if we throw all of our anxieties and nervousness and fears for our children into one potential hazard, we can completely ignore a bunch that are much more serious risks and have a big net harm. And I think
brilliant, exactly.
It's you.
Yeah.
I'm just paraphrasing here.
Yeah, exactly. If we focus on something that's really scary, it's hard to let that fear go. But we can also take it a step back and look at the big picture. What is the path of least harm? What's the path of least harm for us, for the environment? We can do that. We can see that path, and we can.
That takes a huge regulatory paradigm shift, right? Because I think most toxins and substances are regulated as individual units. We figured, okay, what's the lowest? In most places we'll say, what's the threshold dose? But it's still, I think the linear no threshold is actually being applied to a whole variety of different things now. But we're not looking at within a landscape of, okay, if we make this choice, these other risks are higher, and we just fail to regulate things seriously. Yeah. Or to the degree that we do with nuclear. I think Anton van der Merwe, who I had on, he's a co-founder of Doctors for Nuclear Energy with me. He talked about how the regulational limits that are set for PM 2.5 pollution, are set 100 times less stringently than those for radiation in terms of
the impact for sure
on health, right? So
I would love to have this map where if you ever have radioactive fallout maps, like the plume is traveling, that you would contrast it with air pollution traveling and with the level of risk, like where is and you would see that disappear into this big smoky cloud of air pollution. Yeah, exactly. That there are always risks to the alternative. You would never have the zero risk alternative. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's leave it there, Iida. Once again, tons of fun. Thanks
so much.
Yeah. Thanks again for coming on.
Talk to you.
Yeah. If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.